My name's Carson. I've recently joined Southpac as an investment specialist. I'm originally from New Zealand. I grew up in Christchurch and studied in Dunedin at the University of Otago. But for the last 15 years I've been based in Sydney in Australia, and I've been working in the financial services sector there, both in funds management and in private wealth management and private banking. For the last few years I ran my own funds management business, Quick Brown Fox Asset Management, which was a funds management business focused on Australian equities. Prior to that, I was the head of equities at Commonwealth Private Bank, Commonwealth Bank being the largest bank in Australia. Southpac is an interesting business. It's in a niche space. It's in a niche space which can grow. Asset protection globally is an industry which isn't well understood and isn't really well known, but is one with a lot of potential in front of it. I think Southpac Group provides a service which is very valuable to its clients. And I think a lot of people out there could use the service of Southpac Group but don't understand what it is we do and how we can help them. Look, I'm a big believer in the theory of secular stagnation, which was a theory which was developed in the 1930s and was recently repopularized by Larry Summers, the US economist. And that's the theory behind that is GDP growth globally, and particularly in the developed world, is slowing, and it's slowing on the back of four factors: deleveraging, demographics, wealth transfer, and technological change. Now, two of those themes really stand out to me. The first one is deleveraging, which is the paying down of debt. If you look at the last 30 years of economic history, what you find is that interest rates have gone down and debt levels have gone up. Effectively, the world is in a debt supercycle. This is very similar to what we saw back in the 1920s and 30s, and today we're seeing a lot of the similar themes emerge again. So on that point, the next 10, 20 years are going to look very, very different from the last 30 years, both in economics and in markets, so investors have to be prepared for that. The second one I want to touch on is wealth transfer or inequality. And what we're seeing here, again, similar to the 1930s, is a rising disparity between those who have wealth and those who don't in the developed world. And if you look at the proportion of wealth between the top 0.1% and the bottom 90% in the US, it's actually back to where it was in the 1930s. Again, the similarities between that time and now. The problem we find with most investors in the world is their memory doesn't go back to the 1930s. In fact, they probably weren't alive in the 1930s. Very few were, and if they were, they weren't investing. So we find people have knowledge of the history of recent times from the 1980s onwards, but we think going forward that the future is going to look very different from that recent history. In Europe, you've seen protests such as the Yellow Vests in France. You've also, in elections, seen a rise of far-right and far-left parties taking a greater share of the vote. In Hong Kong, recently you've seen protests as the Chinese have looked to apply extradition laws. Now, the common theme among this is the working class is looking for someone to blame for their problems of recent years, the rise of inequality, the stagnating wages. Donald Trump has had success in his political life in pointing the finger at China, and that's led to a trade war. Now, this trade war has the potential to be a catalyst, and that catalyst will be a downturn in global trade. Now, because of the very high debt levels that I talked about previously, global economies are very vulnerable, and small catalysts can have a bigger impact. Now, of course, there are no certainties, but there are a lot of risks out there. Of course, we've got no idea what is going to happen in the future, but we do realize that the world is changing. Investors need to adapt. They need to think differently. They also need to think about asset protection, because the world is changing. It's changing in an economic sense, it's changing in a political sense, and there are no guarantees about what the world will look like in an economic sense in 5, 10, 15 years' time. So I think now is actually a really interesting time for investors to consider their asset protection options, and if you are interested, we're always interested in talking to you.